And thanks to Sabrina and Karma and Philip and the whole team for this lovely invitation. It's really a treat to get to know you, Dike, and to speak about your new body of work, which we're sitting in right here. I wanted to start with a quote that I found of yours, if that's all right. Kind of
depends.
Trolling your website and found this really great quote in an article you wrote in 1998 called Aliens, Abstraction, and 2Kism. Do you remember this?
I do.
Okay. And you write, the more I contemplate what is considered abstract art, the more material and object-oriented it becomes, while the tenets of illusionism that support a figurative art start to seem very abstract. And so I think that kind of pivot or ping pong between the abstract and the objective really comes to the fore in this body of work. And maybe as a way into the works we see in this room, which you've painted from 2020 to 2023, was it past 2 years?
Yeah, about right, yep.
Yeah, maybe tell us kind of about that shift and what we're looking at here.
Yeah, I think that shift was probably most evident when I was still making sculpture and, painterly, abstract sculpture, and then the flip side, the gouaches that were representational, and and there was just the paradox of representation feeling more abstract than the concreteness of the sculpture. But that being said, I think the sculpture has kind of manifested itself a bit in the oil paintings, because the oil paintings have a different kind of physicality than the gouaches had. But I think that's, I think it's present.
Yeah, and you started using the oils in 2017?
Yes.
You made that shift, and do you find that it allowed you to kind of work in a more fluid way or an intuitive way, or what was the big difference in making that leap?
Well, I was trying to learn. I went to the art supply store and bought how to paint in oil, and I learned things like, intaglio and all this stuff. And so I did a lot of practice paintings. But the biggest difference between the gouache work and the oils had to do with that kind of those millimeters of tactility that the oil paint has that the gouaches didn't have. They were essentially, I was almost kind of dyeing the paper, whereas this is sticking stuff on a surface.
Right, and the panel itself as well, it's aluminum panel. I mean, were you working with that kind of luminosity, or?
The aluminum is a kind of, that doesn't really matter. I started painting on wood, and then I started to have problems with warping and stuff, and so I just looked for, there's just, it doesn't matter if it's wood gessoed or aluminum gessoed. It's kind of, it's just, I like a flat, hard surface. I've never been good at bouncy surfaces, so.
Right. And in your works, we should maybe talk a bit about your process. I think you haven't shown in LA in quite some time, and just for folks who might not really know the whole, it's 4 decades you've been painting in this way, and the kind of working from photographs that you snap, and your snapshots, both analog and digital, an archive of images. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. I started, painting these in this scale and this manner in the early '80s, and I'm sorry, I've spoken about some of these things before, but I was seeing something like a boat on a bay, and I said, I'd like to paint that, and then the little voice that says, you can't paint that, you're a hip young New York artist, which, and whenever that no voice comes, you have to kind of you have to do it because you can't listen to that voice. So I started painting what I considered then essentially Sunday paintings, and they were observational. I'd go out and look at the boat in the bay and try to paint it. And then gradually, the mosquitoes started to drive me nuts, and I started to paint from memory, observation and memory. And then I started taking snapshots and using them as a sort of as an aid. And then the photography became more important, and I'd paint from film, and then moved. And there are a couple paintings in here, this being one of them, that was an image I took in the 90s with a film camera. And I got, and I have an image archive, so I'll go back, and it doesn't quite matter. Well, it can matter, but I try to pick things that don't necessarily scream their time period. That doesn't always work, but and then it ends up iPhone, So I use the photography more or less as a one would use drawing. I don't take pictures to show pictures. I tend to take pictures that I think might make a good painting, and then, since of course after decades of doing this, it becomes clear to me, what might be a good painting. And certainly there's some self-reflexivity of, oh, that could be a Dike Blair painting, or again, not always a good idea, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think in that idea of what could be a good Dike Blair painting, I think I read somewhere that sometimes your wife takes the snapshots that you end up painting as well, so that somebody else might know as well what your eye would
she
be
knows. I mean, she's pretty familiar with what I take a picture of.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then also thinking about the photographic and the kind of collapse of time that it offers you, and to be working from an archive of images taken from all periods, whether it's the 90s. I know there are several works in the show painted from photographs you took on a trip to Japan, and Sabrina and I were talking, and she said, you would think that Dike takes trips to Japan all the time, but that's not the case. You've been there once, and you just kind of keep mining this body of work. And I don't know, maybe you could say something about that collapse of time, and if it does something for you in terms of memory or these moments that are getting caught.
I think the issue of time is more at play of why I wouldn't. There's a fetishistic investment of labor in the painting, and that just slows time, and and it doesn't matter. I don't think in some ways the image may be important to me and may be my excuse to paint it, but it's I think there's the slowing of the photographic image versus looking at a photograph that interests me. Like I say, I can't stand looking at my photographs on a wall, but I can deal with looking at my painting on a wall.
Yeah, sure. And I also read, kind of to extend that further, that you actually like seeing your photographs in the magazine format.
That's the only. That's a format I can accept. But
and yesterday when we were speaking, you said, I like to editorialize my photos. So I'm wondering if there's, your work in the magazine world as an editor, as a writer, does that affect your eye at all?
Well, I would say in my studio, when I'm picking, I paint in groups of, usually around 5-6 paintings, and I try to pick 5 or 6 images of paintings that would be, each painting would require something of a different approach, and to keep it interesting. And as a result, so I wouldn't necessarily say paint 5 nocturnes or 5 cocktails or something. So So the same element as if you're doing a layout. I think a layout in a magazine where you'd want, where I would want the images to be somewhat unique and to address each other in some way that's not necessarily expected.
Sure.
Yeah.
And does that also enter into the hang of the show as well? So this particular body of work, the kind of selection of what's in, what's out, I mean, are you thinking of a grand narrative, or are these really those kind of isolated moments?
I mean, there's just there's an element of just design, interior decoration. I mean, that that you want a wall to and a sequence of paintings to kind of keep interesting in scale, in color, and value, tone, all that stuff. So the installation. I mean, I have done installations that are thematic. In this case, there's no particular theme. I mean, I've clearly I've painted a bunch of cocktails. I've painted a lot of windows, a lot of doors, a lot of footprints in snow, a lot of anyway. So I revisit these subjects, and I'm always kind of looking for a new sort of category of subject that when I was younger would come to me more frequently. Now I'm really lucky if I kind of get a eureka moment of something new I could paint.
Yeah, I mean, I think my first impression of a lot of these works really was about a kind of good life, like the life of leisure, the life of travel and pleasure and sushi and cocktails and, the vista out the window, and, painting them during the lockdown, a lot of them.
Yeah. I mean, pleasure, I think, is the important word there, because there's a pleasure, just the visual pleasure of navigating paintings, and I mean, it doesn't, it can be a painting of a carcass or something, and there's pleasure in navigating that. I choose more obvious signs of pleasure, but what I want to happen is for people to find pleasure in looking at the painting, whether it's a cocktail or a window or whatever.
Does it matter to you if the viewer knows that it's kind of your diaristic impressions, or are they meant to be more anonymous?
Well, I think they're supposed to be. I mean, they're clearly or not. They're on my photographs, so they're diaristic by nature, but I try to choose, kind of pretty quotidian things that everybody in the room has experienced, so there's never what is that, or can you please explain that to me? I mean, it's kind of self-evident,
I want to ask you mentioned earlier in our conversation, say, being a young, hot artist in New York and in the village.
I was never hot.
And yet, you are often grouped with like a certain era of artists, whether it's pictures generation or I think I was reading, there was a brief movement called Energism, which I had not heard of, but I was sort of thinking about Larry, thinking about the kind of movements and West Coast, post-war art that your work also speaks to. People like Via Selmans and Ed Ruscha and Al Ruppersberg with his paintings of books, and and there's so many more. We could talk about movies and film stills and the kind of cinematic in all of these works. And I just wonder if bringing these to the West Coast, do you feel like there's a different read? I mean, it's kind of, you've brought these beautiful pictures west for us, and now all of a sudden, I feel like they're about us. They're about LA. They're speaking to us.
Well, I mean, great. I mean, people always, when I was young, oh, this will go over really great in LA, and it would kind of go over okay. And oh, Japan, they'll love these in Japan. And I got to show 2 paintings there, So it's, they're, it's not up to me to know how they travel. I don't think they're particularly, New York-centric paintings at all. They may be, but I'm not sure I think of them that way.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the quality of light in these works, because I think that's one LA art cliche, is that we have the best light, or we have a certain quality of light that's led to light and space art and finished fetish art, and certainly there's like I said, a cinematic quality to the light in your work. And could you sort of tell us a bit about that and how you represent that?
Well, when the luminists, especially American luminists, and particularly someone like Martin Johnson Heade, when I was young, this was just like, oh, wow. I was really captivated, and I kind of like to think that I think I am a kind of a luminist painter. And then the very, the best thing, and sometimes lights are my subject, and then when light can kind of go from being the subject to the verb, is that's a kind of synesthesia that doesn't. I'd like it to happen more often than it does, but that's when I'm happy.
Yeah. And do you feel that when you're making them, or when it's done, after it's complete?
It can come and go, and and I'm sure there are a bunch of painters here, and there's nothing worse than 7/8 of the way you've kind of got that, and then you just work on it another day, and it goes away.
Yeah.
But
I want to kind of press you a little bit more on the California side, because I know that you're a fan of John McLaughlin, and you also did a series of paintings in homage to him, I suppose, or kind of based off of snapshots you took of a gallery exhibition of his work. And for those of you who don't know, John McLaughlin was a mid-centuries, 40s and 50s LA painter of hard edge abstraction. So a lot of gray stripes, black stripes. It was really a moment, I think, in LA's art history where he and McLaughlin and a group of artists were trying to kind of create a homegrown modernism in LA. And they had to kind of brand themselves, maybe like the Energism artists did, but they were labeled abstract classicists. And I really like that idea of a kind of classicism. This was well before minimalism. A classicism in painting that is at once, abstract and these kind of fields of emptiness. I think it's no secret that you often cite Zen in your work, or maybe have in the past.
I think maybe other people. I don't know that I've ever. I'm not sure I've ever said Zen. No, I mean, you're often really attracted to what you're not. I mean, and that's the case of, I love McLaughlin, and I love John McCracken, and there's so much that I can't do it, but you often, or I'm very attracted to the flip side of things, and they're very much not what I am.
Sure.
But maybe I wish I was.
And I would argue, your works approach that kind of purism, I don't know if that's the right word, or purity of emptiness and the lines, the kind of hard edges, particularly in these 3 works over here. You can see those bold vertical lines, and I just wonder, if there's if there's something there with a kind of
I'd like to think so. I mean, skies, I had ambitions to try to paint nothing, but I kind of found that they looked like nothing. But when you framed it, when you put some architectural. Also, I know, if I'm doing nature, I always want a little bit of culture, and so so the window frames and things allow me to do the more empty surface or.
And you stop just short of kind of emptying them out completely. And it seems like
Because I don't think, because they're not, when I've tried the close, I get as close as I can. So, but that's also, again, the flip sides. I mean, the stolives are all, the compositions are all pretty banal. Like there's, the drink sitting in the center of the rectangle, and when and so the other side of that is to kind of try to have the subject of something more empty and the information going along the edges. So it's just a kind of compositional formalist flip side.
Yeah, right. And even these kind of more minimal or stripped down ones, I'd say there's a lot of layering. And as flat as they are, there's layering of kind of surfaces. You're looking through water, you're looking through glass, and the kind of like soft focus that creates is really nice. Again, going back to cinema, maybe, I think one of the first things I thought of when seeing this work installed this way was a kind of like serial repetition of film images or filmic photography. So I think it's
and without the people,
right.
Which is, when I'm really anyway, I like to see. I sometimes subtract people from what I'm looking at.
Right. And yet you listen to narratives while you paint. So you listen to audiobooks?
Yes, because there's a certain, I don't need a certain part of it would be boring to paint some of these things without some distraction. So I listen to pretty lousy stuff that's plot driven.
Yeah.
Whereas, again, I'm not doing the sculpture now, but when I did the sculpture, I could only listen to music. So.
Yeah. And yesterday you said you miss making the sculpture.
I missed that element of it. And I tried to figure out ways around. I mean, I sort of physically couldn't do the kind of work I was doing. I got sick of storing them because I couldn't sell them, and and then with the again, with it just becoming too physically complicated, I'm completely happy doing what I'm doing.
I know.
But I keep looking. I mean, I do keep looking for some solution to work with paint in a way that that I have more decision making of that nature. And there's a bit of it. It's just on this now. It's on this teeny little scale.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think there's a cliche in LA that there's like unlimited space and unlimited resources to fabricate whatever you want, which is true, somewhat true. There's access to that, but I think scale and keeping it intimate and small is what's really special about these works. And to see you scale up, I don't know. Have you thought about that with your paintings? I don't know if they'd be the same paintings.
I mean, I have done larger scale work. Again, this particular approach doesn't seem to work. If this is 8 by 6 feet, I'm working on that stupid thing for a year, which I'm not interested in doing. Yeah.
How quickly do you paint? Like something like this?
Well, it varies, but it might boil down to a painting a week if you look at any given year. That's crude.
Yeah.
And it's a crude idea to kind of.
I think that's prolific. I don't know. That's prolific, but. Yeah, are there questions? Should we open it up to
Sure,
others?
sure.
What's the editorial process between the photograph and the painting? Like, how much editorial happens when you take the photograph, or or is it happens more when you're starting the painting?
It's kind of it's both. When I'm because I'm I'm first saying, oh, that might be a good painting, or that would be interesting to paint, and I'll take the picture, and I may well reject. 9 out of 10 times I'll probably not choose to paint that painting. There's since there's the diaristic, there's also the kind of fictional narrative of. I think one of the things that happens is, who's the guy why is this guy painting these stupid things? And so there's that, which is me, and I'm also, there is the fiction of who the artist is who's painting these things. Now, I'm trying to be, of course, I'm trying to be real, but, that's not always the way it works.
But if it's a depiction of a photograph and you really editorialize it, you're creating yet another layer of fiction.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm kind of where I'm going with that, yeah. Okay.
When you switch to, say, film, which seems more like contrast and darks, to using an iPhone, which every update allows for like brighter night nocturnal photos.
Yeah.
There's a shift to do like that. Did it change your palette, or how you?
Yeah, it did change things, and in the film, as we know, the film's got this kind of liquid quality that that is, works very well with oil paint, but the, sitting out at night trying to get a good 30-second exposure, there's a convenience that I sort of was able to give up film.
With the film, you were taking long exposures.
Yeah.
Mostly like snapshots.
Yeah. It's, again, there's just a convenience that, not to mention expense, of course. Everyone, film was expensive, Yeah.
It's exciting to hear you say that you paint nothing. It's exciting as well to talk about making this approach from fictionality. I'm tempted to ask, to what extent do you like inviting art historical associations? And then to get specific, this is probably because we went across the paths, I associate sort of intersectionality of your images a lot with sort of Turn the Line, Purple Magazine milieu. How would you describe that kind of attention to the image in context?
And I was part of Purple from the get-go, but there was a very particular aesthetic, and then you say Wolfgang Tillmans and people like that was pretty specific that I didn't necessarily think I was part of. I may have lost the thread there.
How do you think about this image, like the kind of emptiness that you're talking about as being specific to this moment? It's really, it's interesting.
I think in terms of emptiness, I was saying, liking to kind of try to approach it with some of these window pieces and some of usually the larger ones, the elevators, but I'm not quite sure they're they're pretty chunky. I'm sorry, Tim. I'm not giving a good reply on that.
Yeah, I'm curious, maybe to build on Tim's question, because in my mind, and going to art school in the early 2000s, purple was kind of this barometer of taste and what was cool at the moment, and this really like, you were instrumental in that. You were an editor, you wrote for the magazine, sometimes your photos appeared in the magazine, and yet in your painting life, you're quite humble and sort of anti-style. It seems almost the antithesis of that, kind of the cycles of fashion and the cycles of taste and even the cycles of an editorial or the way a magazine is printed, the speed that things get digested. Obviously the paintings slow everything way down. And yet, as Tim points out, I think you are a kind of signifier of that moment, and your work is as well.
I mean, you know, I love, you know, I like the magazine. I learned an awful lot working with all those people. I don't know how well and they curated, and I worked with them, and I designed exhibitions, but I wouldn't necessarily say I had that particular young French fashionable aesthetic.
Would you differ, Tim? Would you argue?
For me, I just think about one, what sort of art historical associations are in here, but then two, even with your writing, you've moved, forget about the magazine, just through dialogues around fashion, around design, your pleasure in objects, that had a very particular cultural moment that ends up having your attention focused in a very particular way in these paintings. And so that was what I sought to sort of approach, and that I think is really sort of present and only more resonant over the years.
Yeah, I mean, some of that's not always visible to me, maybe, but yeah, and that when I was part of the magazine you were an editor of, was what had to do with design and architecture. And I made installations in the early 90s that did specifically address, I think, those issues. After a stinker of a installation show in Vienna, I had a kind of like bump, and I segregated my writing, my teaching, all of that from the studio practice, kind of quite intentionally, and I think to the advantage, perhaps, of both.
And art history? I mean, recently you had a kind of deep dialogue with Edward Hopper as one art historical touch point.
You know, I mean, I went to art school, and then yes, I mean, art has, and I paint. It's really fun to kind of paint paintings, other people's paintings. The painting's not in the show, I wish it were, but a Fairfield Porter painting that I painted, and I just sort of, you know, it was a painting in situ, so it was a crop bit of the Fairfield Porter. But, you know, I kind of learned so much about how Fairfield Porter painted by painting his painting. And, you know, I've done it with Van Gogh and Kleitz with Dutch still life, and, you know, it's engaging. And, you know, and also part of that is when, you know, many of my images come when, you know, some of them are, you know, some of them here are like, oh, this is my elevator, this is my coffee, this is my home, but a lot of it is traveling, and I don't really, you know, and I look at art more when I'm traveling than anything, so it becomes a kind of a weird leisure concentration when you actually can look at something because you're not thinking about, you know, your dentist or feeding the cat or whatever.
Yeah, and do you think that kind of appropriation is why maybe you get not grouped, but you're affiliated with the Pictures Generation artists and Sarah Charlesworth, you know, people, appropriation?
I don't know, I'm not sure. I mean, these were friends, but I don't think anybody thinks of me as a pictures artist. But, I mean, but what do I know?
No, they're not as, yours are not that cool.
Yeah. Yeah. No, they're much more romantic and and occasionally sentimental almost. And I'm not, I'm not necessarily happy about that. Well, it is like you have to be kind of true. You have to be true to who you are, and so that's I wish I were John McLaughlin. I'm not.
I like what you said, sentimental, that's a good word. At the risk of stating the obvious, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the lack of, there's no figures, there's no subjects in any of the paintings. Maybe that speaks to like that sentimental, almost nostalgic quality, but if you could talk a little bit about that decision to not, a lot of it has sort of traces of people, like a cocktail has been drank, but the person isn't there.
Yeah. I think it's, I mean, the presence of someone's eye is there in all of them, and mine particularly. When I've painted, not many people. For a while, I painted women's eyes for a while, and I found that somehow complicated enough in terms of being about someone and looking, but without the psychology. And I think I just think the encountering figurative painting just I mean, of course it's great. It just doesn't function. I prefer objects to people, perhaps.
I have to ask you one last question before, if there are no more from the audience, but maybe there are. You mentioned you were privileged enough to have done a Raymond Chandler book cover. And I love that because, again, going back to my LA centrism, the idea of a crime scene or the noir that works in these, these pictures. There's also a dark side here. I mean, it's a good life, it's a beautiful life, but it's a life of cocktails and cigarettes and, dirty diners maybe or whatnot. The elevator corner that has a untold dark side or grunge,
No, there's older gouaches, I think, have, they're a little darker, a little more, they're more noirish, and I love noir. But anyway, there was a recent edition, a reprint of a Bantam book of Chandler's playback, and they asked if they could use a picture of one of my nocturne swimming pools for the cover. And I am so much more thrilled, well, I don't want to say I'm more thrilled than I am by this, but it really thrilled me, to kind of look at a Raymond Chandler book with one of my paintings on it. This was a thrill.
There are other questions before we wrap up?
Thanks, guys.
Oh, one more, yes.
Just ask one maybe to end it up. Is it a practical solution, or is there something deeper about the visual profile? What is it, dive-on frames or metal frames that holding these dive-on objects?
Yeah, this is brand new. This is the first time I've shown framed, these paintings framed. Sort of beneath here, there used to be, you'd see a little bit of the history of the painting. They were just kind of sloppy and all that. I don't know, this added a kind of a nice elegance and a sort of finality of thought that I'm enjoying, but yeah.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you,
Friday
everybody.
night.
Thank you.